Howdy folks, Deacon Parsons here. Today we're going to look at collectivism, individualism, and why what seems like really good ideas just don't seem to work out. Before we start, I want to use an example from manufacturing as a benchmark in the discussion. We have a machine and it makes widgets. The ability of that machine to make widgets is described as its capacity. Now every machine has three different kinds of capacity. There's a machine capacity, a calculated capacity, and a demonstrated capacity. How these different capacities are measured and how they relate to each other for planning purposes will be important for our discussion. First comes machine capacity. When our machine is up and running, it can cycle 10 times per minute. That means 600 widgets per hour times 8 hours equals 4,800 widgets per shift. This is the maximum we could ever expect under any circumstances. However, just because a machine can cycle 10 times per minute doesn't mean it can do so for 8 hours straight. For this, we need to calculate a capacity. To calculate the capacity, we begin with the machine cycle rate of 10 widgets per minute. Then try to predict what factors need to be considered to operate the machine that will limit that output. How much time does it take from start to full speed? How often does the feedstock need to be reloaded? How often do you need to do a QC check? How long to do changeovers and setups? How about operator breaks and machine maintenance? When we take into account every conceivable possibility, we have a calculated capacity for the machine. It will be much more realistic than the machine capacity, but it still isn't a reliable number. Okay, why is that? Because it's only as accurate as our crystal ball's ability to predict the future. The third type of capacity is the most accurate and reliable. This is the one that we use to plan our manufacturing and to promise our customers. That is our demonstrated capacity. What have we actually done in the past? You know, history. As we analyze communism and anarchy, please keep these three capacity measurements in mind, and remember, only demonstrated capacity is real. First, let's look at communism. This is the complete submission of the individual to the collective. The collective is all, the individual is nothing. If you're from my generation, you're familiar with the concept and its massive failure. Communism is zero private property. Everything is owned by the collective. People are supposed to contribute according to their abilities and receive distributions according to their needs. This system has some very attractive qualities. The machine and calculated capacities are pretty wonderful. Everyone works to their ability and gets per their needs. Kind of sounds like Star Trek. Most people think the fatal flaw in communism is the calculated capacity. To institute communism on a nationwide level, one must have a state and give complete and total control to that state. Now, history's proven that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We normally apply this to absolute monarchs. However, what Chinese and Soviet communism has taught us is that absolute power corruption of one person is very small compared to the absolute power corruption of an organized state. Life under the czars was oppressive and many people died. Life under Soviet communism killed millions and made life under the czars look like a cakewalk. Remember this little historical tidbit the next time you hear somebody say, well, any change would be better, 'cause no, not always. But state control, as bad as it is not the fatal flaw of communism. Let's look at a couple of cases of communism at a community level from American history that show us the fatal flaw. Now, both Jamestown and Plymouth colonies began as communes. Nobody owned any land, everyone put everything into the common storehouse, and everyone got from the storehouse as they needed. Both colonies reached starvation levels very soon. Both colonies only survived by adopting private property, individual responsibility, and a free market. Now, a lot of capitalists like to use these examples to say that the free market profit motive is what makes capitalism succeed. This isn't true. It's not the freedom to succeed that makes capitalism works. It's the freedom to fail. When John Smith took over Jamestown and divided out the land, he instituted an old biblical concept. He who will not work, neither let him eat. I submit that the success of free market capitalism is not greed. It is the fear of going hungry that motivates people to work and prosper. Now, kind of as a side note, this is why governments should never be involved in charity or safety net programs. Communism's demonstrated capacity, both on a national and community level, is that it's a massive failure. But here's why it fails. Human nature does not allow a system like communism to function. Whether one takes an evolutionary view or a religious view, the basic nature of average human beings is not altruistic. The average human being is motivated by self-interest. That is why for centuries monasteries have been set up to allow those enlightened people to practice selfless altruism away from the influence of the world. A corollary to self-interest is tribalism. To one degree or another, humans are social creatures. They are either born into or form in-groups. Now, if there are in-groups, there are of necessity out-groups. The in-group, out-group conflict is a constant across all humans in every time and every culture. Both individual self-interest and tribalism is why we can't give unlimited power to a state. The humans that comprise the government will be corrupted, the state will be overbearing and destroy anyone and everyone except those in the in-group who run the state. Okay, now we're going to swing the pendulum all the way to the opposite end. Anarchy. Now, anarchy is not a room full of kindergartners on a sugar rush. Anarchy is a complete lack of government or a state. This is the system where the individual is supreme. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, if I could wave a magic wand and make things happen, living in a world with no government would be my dream. As with communism, machine capacity and calculated capacity are pretty wonderful. Unfortunately, reality and history are cruel mistresses, and the demonstrated capacity of this lifestyle is equally dismal. There are many anarchists and anarcho-libertarians today that are under the impression that their idea of living without a state is somehow new, that there's no historical precedent for such a way of life. This concept is inaccurate. I'll give 3 examples for you to research deeper if you're interested in. Number 1 is the Norse. The Nordic people, commonly called Vikings, were the very last Europeans to create nation-states. Through most of their history, they weren't really even all that tribal. In most cases, local leaders weren't hereditary, but led by their own charisma and merit. There were very few courts of law, and for the most part, people settled their own disputes. Number 2, the fall of the Western Roman Empire / Dark Ages. It is important to remember that the fall of Rome was not a headline in a newspaper. There was no official announcement that said, hear ye, Rome has fallen, begin the Dark Ages now. The Roman government simply atrophied and slowly stopped functioning. People in forgotten or abandoned locales were left to fend for themselves. Example number 3, the westward expansion of the United States. especially early on as settlers left the confines of established governments and moved out into new areas. They lived without a state or government in their lives. Now, all three of these situations developed and adopted governments for basically the same reasons. Again, human nature does not allow a stateless system to function. Whether one takes an evolutionary view or a religious view, the basic nature of the average human being is not altruistic. The average human is motivated by self-interest. Humans are also social creatures. Some form of tribalism will arise. This tribalism will take two major forms in a stateless system: criminal gangs or feuds. When criminals figured out that they can gang together and steal things from individuals, the individual victims must band together to combat the criminals or remain sheep to be sheared at the criminal's whim. Hello, government. Even without the criminal element, the more people you have in a given area, the more conflicts will arise that need to be settled. As those individuals settle their argument, the losers will invariably feel that they were treated unjustly and enlist the help of others in their tribe to gain what they consider justice. The Hatfield-McCoy feud is the most famous, but by no means the only feud to take place where there was no strong state. As for stateless individuals working together in concert to create some community good, it is almost always impossible to get the consent, cooperation, and resources from everyone involved to complete the project fairly. Humans are not rational creatures and will often be contrary simple for the perverse pleasure of being contrary. For instance, I'll just let others build the bridge across the river with their labor and resources, and I'll use it when they're done. So what are we left with? The need to balance too much government with not enough government. This is the same need the Founding Fathers faced from 1777 when they developed the Articles of Confederation to 1789 when our Constitution was adopted. King George was too much government. The Articles of Confederation were too little. They spent a long decade designing a balance in the middle ground. To reach their goals, they needed a small, limited government that will respect individual rights as far as humanly possible and yet still provide legal infrastructure required to create liberty, opportunity, and justice for as close to all people as is humanly possible. What they came up with is our Constitution. Right now, the United States government is no longer the limited government it was supposed to be. We are currently a socialist state and growing more since the 1930s. Full-on bread and circuses started with FDR. There is enough blame for this to go around for all of us to share. The government of the United States is currently reaching critical mass to fall per Tytler's 200-year cycle. Now, if you're interested, please see my video, Voting Rights or Responsibility, Paying the Piper and Calling the Tune, for a fuller explanation of Tytler's theorem. The question remains, if it falls, what do we replace it with? Communism and anarchy have failed historically. Neither anarchy nor communism has a demonstrated capacity to produce liberty and prosperity. The one system that created more wealth and freedom for more people than any other in human history is the limited government of the U.S. Constitution from 1789 to 1932. If we cannot reform and salvage the current government, the only historically logical course of action is to destroy the current government, learn from history, and restore our government to its roots, with such tweaks as may be required to see if we can break Tytler's 200-year cycle the next time around. And if you've got a minute, check out the low bar. I'm going to put a link in there to a spot from Monty Python that I think is just hilarious and really kind of tops off this video. This is Deacon Parsons saying, love your maker, love your mate, and do what's right because it's right, and devil take the hindmost.